the Programs and Visitor Center coordinator at the Stowe Center for Literary Activism, where we speak to encourage social justice and literary activism by exploring the life and legacy of Harry Beecher Stowe and all who advocate hope and freedom then and now. I would also like to thank our Harvard Public Library partners for hosting Read for Change this evening. It's our last of the season. So we're just very thankful to just do this in person, a little bit impromptu, but it's also just really great just for all us to be together. Really, really good. Thank you so much for being here for our monthly reading group that focuses on Stowe Center's Stowe Prize shortlist. For the final book for this Read for Change season, the Stowe Center has chosen Edwin Raymond's memoir, An Inconvenient Cop, I Fight to Change Policing in America. This evening will be a little bit different than our normal community conversation, but instead, there will be a conversation between Edwin Raymond and Dr. Mallery that is then followed by a Q&A. Edwin Raymond is a 15-year veteran of the New York Police Department, the highest-ranking whistleblower of the NYPD, and a civil rights advocate whose work challenges systemic racism and inequity in modern policing. He has received numerous awards, such as Commanding Officers Award for Exceptional Duty, and the NYPD Courage for Leadership Award, the International Documentary Association's Courage Under Fire Award, and Rockstar Award. Just to get them all in one paragraph. Dr. Michael Mallery is the chair of the Stowe Center's Board of Trustees. Dr. Michael Mallery is also a scholar, activist who works centers on education, equity, and community empowerment. With more than 14 years of experience inspiring students and educators across the country, he brings an essential lens to conversations about justice and social change. His commitment to fostering dialogue and civic engagement makes him a vital guide exploring the memoir's urgent themes. So I've said a lot, and we're going to bring it to the start of the show. So take it away.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So glad to see you all for an important conversation. Hopefully everybody's having a positive 26 vibes so far. There's a lot happening in the world, but we're here, we're live, and we're going to keep doing our part. Super excited to be here with this good brother, in a moment of time that for so many people, and I'm sure your phone probably has been blowing up what's been happening with ICE on this dynamic, but in a moment of time that to have a book that not only spoke volumes, but when you just think about what the criminal injustice system has been and has meant to so many people for generations in the American context, specifically when it comes to engagement with the police, right? And to have this book, An Inconvenient Cop, because so many times we've heard no justice, no peace, we've seen the marches, we continue to see marches. We have, went from civil rights movement to hashtags to modern day, and to have a member of law enforcement who have produced a book from his lens, his experiences. And as I was just mentioning to him a few minutes ago, was 10 toes down to say, my moral compass led me to this work. Is inspiring. So, Brother Edwin, thank you for joining us, man. I think what would be a good place to start is to those who, and just to let you know, Read for Change, many people have read the book, some people might not have read the book. So if you kind of gave the elevator pitch of who you are and your background, and then what inspired you to write the book, I think that would be a great start.
Absolutely. Thank you for that intro. Thank you to the Stowe Center. Thank you to Hartford Library, and everyone in attendance and everyone zooming in. In short, I'm just someone that loves the people. You understand? Rather than be deterred from joining the police because of my experiences as a teenager, instead I joined with the magnifying glass, trying to see what was wrong. And once I realized, again, not the silver bullet, but definitely something that needs to be addressed, being the quotas and the pressure and what leads to that initial stop. Because, all of the work matters. But I want to get it as far upstream as possible. You understand? So I risked everything and I did the unthinkable. And what allowed me to do that, unfortunately, is the rough childhood. I already knew how to suffer. So when the retaliation came, it wasn't easy, but I'd been through this already. I knew how to be uncomfortable. It wasn't good for my mental health, but it was essential because it was something so much bigger than me.
So, for so to get us started, I guess give people contextually in the way you want to kind of wrap it up. What was Edwin's self-identity growing up? Then, when you transitioned to make the decision to join law enforcement, what were you say your self-identity morphed into? And then to the time that you got into seeing these things happening from the inside, where do you believe your self-identity arrived?
That's a great question. Honestly, and even friends from high school, middle school, I'm throughout the entire process, I remain true to who I am. Everybody can understand. That's what allows me to not be flooded and changed by tribalism. Because most people, when you're in an environment for an extended time, you start to change, you start to adapt to that environment. And I continue to swim against the current because of my ability to kind of, have my perspective. I'm not stubborn, I'm open to criticism, but it has to make sense. So my ability to kind of stay grounded in who I am and what I believe is right is something that, this is part of the reason why in writing the memoir, the genre of the memoir was chosen. I thought those stories from my childhood were important to show you that, if I was able to survive and make the so-called right choices in a very different New York City, we remember what this country was 30 years ago when it comes, especially with drug crimes. I'm not gonna now join the police department and just go with the flow. I've already shown you, I was never a go with the flow type. It has to make sense. Yeah.
And so, when you talk about your experiences inside, right? So you're in law enforcement, you go through your training, and right, typically standard, right? How do you engage with the public? Right? How do you engage with the community that you will be you'll be working with? How do you carry a firearm? How do you blah 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 blah, right? And so you go through this training, and then to go into your recall memory, first 6 months on the job, take us back to what were your thoughts after you completed the police academy, those first 3 to 6 months?
So I actually start with the book with the very first chapter. I'm going to the police academy because I realized most people will never know what that is. So I wanted to read it to jump right into that experience. And then, the following chapter, the even number chapter, I'm 2 years old, my mother's died, I was actually shocked after 6 months of training. Because the experiences that I had as a young black man, the experiences that I know my peers had, after 6 months of the NYPD Academy, I couldn't pinpoint what led to those experiences, right? The thing that happens outside of the academy, what my experiences were and the experiences of so many other young black folks, I figured you have to be taught this officially because it's too ubiquitous. And then I learned that, no, it's literally keep that bullshit in the academy, kid. Let's teach you the real job. This is not something just for Hollywood. This is what actually happens. And immediately it was like a different world. It's like the movie Full Metal Jacket. It starts off and it's training, and then you're in Vietnam. It becomes a completely different film. Right? So that's what the experience was like.
And so, completely different thing. Okay, you went through the academy, now you're out here now, right? You're patrolling the streets, you're navigating, you're engaging with folks, but you still have, right, Haitian roots, you are everything from the childhood trauma, engaging with your father, right? But you're now in this moment, right, to where it's real. But you start seeing all of these other things that are happening around you that is being justified as No, this is part of the job. This is not the academy. So this is what comes with being in the streets amongst the people. How did that make you feel as you were seeing peripherally things that were happening on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, psychologically it was tough, and I would wake up after the academy, I still couldn't believe I was a police officer, and it wasn't something that I was completely proud about. I don't like to lie, but someone said, "I thought I saw you." I was like, "I'm a traffic agent. I come up with anything else." You sure? I thought you had a gun. I'm like, "They saw me," right? I visit my old neighborhood. I still live in the same community, but on the other side of the neighborhood. And all of a sudden, everyone had somewhere to go. Right? And they didn't want me around. No one wanted the cop around. So that took some adjustment. And then, as a conscious young Black man, I have front row seats to, just watching oppression, like tangible oppression. Like I'm like seeing it where it's right in my face. And I realized that my colleagues did not realize what they were contributing to. And the analogy that I often use to describe this is an assembly line, right? If you're building a Model T Ford, whether your repetitive task is to put on the windshield, the chassis, etc., you're contributing to a vehicle. I realized that my colleagues, the repetitive task of having to write summonses, arrest folks, and every month, being pressured to do it again and again and again, more numbers, they didn't see the larger picture of what they were contributing to. So what did they, if you ask them, hey, so what does all of this mean? They'll give you the company line. But in reality, that's not what's happening. Broken windows policing, quota-driven broken windows policing, quality of life, all the euphemisms that it has. This thing is very detrimental. And I started seeing people that I knew from the academy and how different they were on patrol. My own partner, who I love to death, I spoke to her that one encounter. I said, "What was that?" And she said, "What?" I was like, and she said, "Oh, I'm going on vacation next week. I got to get it out the way, meet her quota." And I said, "Yeah, but that's not who you are. You're from public housing. You're a single mother. You are these people, right? And even if you weren't, you're human." And that's when I started realizing a big part of how this thing operates is it literally dehumanizes people. That's what makes it easy to treat them this way. The us versus them, it becomes clear. You understand? Whereas I'm from the community, I just see people as people. Like I stayed firm on that, but I watched as just 6 months out how much my colleagues were changing and not even questioning what was being asked of them. There were people who were putting human beings in cages for blowing their nose, and calling it littering. For someone using a charger to charge their phone in the subway and calling it theft of service. You're caging a human being for charging their phone. But when you have to meet those numbers, you're not thinking about all of that. The technicality of having probable cause is all you focus on. And that's when I'm like, if I get one shot, what shot would reverberate the strongest to change the system? Because they're not gonna let me take another shot. And that's when I said, I'm gonna come to this quota system.
And so to folks out there on the Zoom who may not truly understand what a quota system is and how it has materialized and manifested itself all across the country. Because you gotta break that down. Some people's like, oh, everyone needs to just get five tickets by the end of the week. That's what the nuances of what the quota is and the pressure, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic, that folks get in line because of it.
So officers having to enforce has always been part of policing for decades. But something happens about 30 years ago in New York that essentially the epicenter that spreads the cancer throughout the country and even jumps the oceans to other parts of the world. And that's broken windows policing, CompStat. CompStat, there are some parts of CompStat that make sense. It's modern, analyzing of data, etc. But the problem with CompStat is commanders who are in charge of precincts. If crime goes up in a particular area, they now have to answer to that. They have to show what they're doing about it. And this is, income's broken windows. The thing that's the accepted answer as to what you're doing about the crime in the area is how many low-level summonses and arrests are being made. And that's broken windows. Broken windows basically makes the argument that if you over-enforce low-level innocuous infractions, it'll prevent the more serious things from happening. It's nonsense. It has never been proven empirically. If anything, every time they try to, all studies show that there's no correlation. But then Commissioner Bill Bryan, who's probably the most famous police officer in the country, if not the world, he believes this. This is his legacy, and it becomes the new way of policing. And the thing is, when people are looking for new police leadership, they often go to retiring or recently retired NYPD executives. So what do they do when they get to Miami? The late Timothy, he recreates what he learned in New York. McCarthy did it in Chicago, Bratton did, goes back to Boston and LA, and then the former mayor Giuliani starts a consulting firm. Again, brings this to Trinidad, Mexico, other parts, South Africa, Copenhagen. Right? I was able to track broken windows policing, this thing that started in New York, and everywhere it went, the cancer went with it. There was always some sort of proletariat to have a focus on, and essentially oppress in the name of public safety. So the quotas is essentially the minimum enforcement required in order to keep the system going. And when I got out of the academy, for me, the numbers were 1, 10, and 10. 4, 10, and 10. 4 arrests, 10 summonses, and 10 stop-ins. And that's just scraping the bottom. If you wanted to get into elite units, if you wanted to stand out and be seen, you have to double those numbers. And this is where the harassment starts. And inevitably, everything comes into alignment, and someone leaves the body bag. When we think of Orlando Castillo, Sandra Bland, Alton Sterling, Eric Garner, I can go on and on. Every single one of those stops were innocuous broken windows type offenses. For Orlando, was it a failure signal, Sandra Bland's failure signal, broken tail light. These are nonsense stops that are treated like the crime of the century because those officers are under pressure. One of the other things I did was every single time I would see something so small be treated so serious, and I'm watching the officer's behavior. I would Google quotas in that respective police department or city, and almost every time at some point there was some sort of either police whistleblower or small town elected official that tried to shine light on these issues. But I realized folks think this is just like annoyance. It's much more than an annoyance. Mathematically, it's what leads. This is the initial police contact that leads to the things that we march in the streets for. Yeah.
So a follow-up to that, and some folks may be thinking this, to kind of follow up on that. So an officer who's engaged in quotas may feel or has felt the pressure to reach those quotas. So let's just say if I was a sales guy and it's like, okay, you need to sell 20 computers and this is your metric, and if you do that, at the end of the year you get a bonus or you may get that promotion. So if you kind of further elaborate on that pressure, is it the pressure to say, you know what, if I don't stand out, I can't get into that elite unit. Or if I don't hit the quotas enough, then my loyalty to the job and or my effectiveness is not questioned. It could be being that, well, you're not effective because you're not getting your quotas, so you need to find another employment.
So essentially, what are the consequences if you don't meet the quota, and also what's the incentive if you do, and what's the incentive if you surpass the quota? Yeah. I'll start with the incentives. Obviously, nepotism and cronyism is very alive and well, but if you don't have those options, the way to stand out in the police department and many of the police departments is the arrest history, right? And if it's not quantity arrest, it's quality. If it's not quality arrest, it's quantity, the amount, right? And because you're stopping people for nonsense, that everyone does, across racial lines. They expect you to, if you're looking, you're gonna find it. Prior to the legalization of marijuana in the state of New York, 40% of all arrests was marijuana related. 92% of those arrested were black and brown, but Department of Health stats show that weed is used pretty evenly across racial lines. In some parts of the country, even more white folks because of disposable income and everything else. So if you want to stand out to put in for a youth, you know, when I speak at colleges, I always tell, it's like I play a trick on the young folks. I create 3 different profiles of cops, right? And I say, if you want to put in for aviation, one was one officer, 5 years on the job, former Air Force pilot, white male, right? Another officer, I'll change the race, I'll say 10 years on the job, former teacher, and the other one, you know, 12 years on the job, no prior work experience. And who do you think would, if they all put in for the aviation unit, who would get it? Most people naturally go with the Air Force. He has the experience. It's a trick question. It's whoever meets the quotas. That's it. It doesn't matter the prior experience, years on the job, race. It's whoever meets those quotas. I mean, race sometimes can play a part. So that's how you stand out. If you surpass the quota, that's how you stand out to be chosen for plum positions. If you just meet the quota, you're left alone, right? But nothing fancy is gonna happen in your life, but you won't be bothered. Now, if you don't meet the quota, you start, first it starts with the conversation, then it leads to real retaliation, right? If you just had a baby and you that evening because your wife works the morning and you have to be with the baby, you know, whatever the situation is, they'll purposely put you. If you, I know people who have been denied going to their loved ones' weddings, days off, you name it, anything that they can do to make your life miserable until you get on board. And most people don't want to go through that. And if those early retaliatory measures don't work, you then put on what's called performance monitoring. And now the union protection is lifted. You're on probation again. So now losing your police rating, things that happen, it's life, right? Or losing yourself, or losing department equipment, anything, it's ground for termination. I've seen it, I've only seen that happen to 2 people because most people would never let it get there. But in order not to get there, they come for you. Yeah.
Wow. And so many people don't obviously understand that. So thank you for elaborating that. If you could humanize and lift up experience families just during that moment, kind of the internal backlash of you engaging with families while quotas were being met and the broken windows policing. What are some of the stories that you just recall that stand out to where, you know, my son was just walking up the street and so forth and so on?
So, still living in the community that I was born and raised in while being a police officer, to this day I get calls. You know, I always tell people, I'm not an attorney, but based on what you just expressed, this is probably what really happened. I got, you want an actual story? Yeah. Something that I witnessed or something that someone brought to me?
I would say you can go both, just, you know, just to
yeah,
color it up.
I'll tell you this one, you know what, I'll share a story about when I realized how powerful tribalism is. Because I was working in plainclothes. The sergeant often chose me because I blended in, right? The sergeant was from Ecuador, so he was a heavy-set Hispanic male. The other officer was I think he was Eastern European Jew, and I'm a Haitian American kid, right? We standing together, we stood out, right? And people would look closer to notice, you know, like, I think they're cops, so this one has the best, or, you know. So we would split up. So we're at the last stop at a station in the subway, and we're in plainclothes, and we're literally just looking for someone to jump the turnstile. And okay, another thing about CompStat, the broken windows. If a serious crime happens somewhere, you don't have to get the person that did the serious crime. You simply have to show an increase of minor arrests and summonses for minor infractions within the vicinity of that crime. And that's an acceptable answer to the executives. So we were at this train station because there were robberies happening around 8, 9 p.m., right? It was already past midnight, right? If the robberies are happening around 8, 9 p.m., we should be there around that time. But again, it's the system. So we're there a little bit after midnight. People are exiting the train station. And there's a gentleman on the other side who does not have the fare. But he's asking if someone can just write them on, if they have the Metro card, which is not illegal as long as there's no money exchanged, right? So we're watching, and people were walking right past New York City style, right? And then he positions himself next to the exit gate. So I look at the sergeant, I look at the other officer, and I'm like, okay, he's about to go through that gate. If he goes through the gate without paying, that's an arrest. So he gets closer, and then one of the last folks on the train, an elderly, a black woman, he's like, man, you got to swipe. She digs into her purse, she swipes them on. I was so upset. Like, damn, because I was up that night, that was gonna be my arrest. And I'm in my head, cursing, I'm like, damn. And then it took about 10 minutes, because now I had to go to another station. And I said, Edwin, did you just get mad because he didn't break the law?
Crazy.
Like, what's happening to you?
Yeah.
Remember why you started this. Remember what you're here to do. And nothing like that ever happened again. But when that moment happened, I said, wow, if that can happen to me, then I get it now. And it helped me humanize my colleagues, because I just didn't get it. The things that my colleagues put people in cages for. But that moment made me realize, man, culture is powerful, right? And one of my mentors always tells me that culture eats policy for lunch. So that answers that Judy question.
Yeah, no, it's powerful because it humanizes, and you do such a great job in the book, but I think telling that story to folks, it humanizes you, one, as a person, but as an officer, but as someone who had the experiences that you had up to the point, joining them first, but to your point with the culture dynamic, it just intrinsically came into wait. You wanted him to break the law. I was shocked. Like, wait, I was upset because he didn't break the law. Yeah.
Think about it. That's what pressure does.
Yeah.
Right. And I know inevitably we're going to get to what's happening temporarily, but when Steve Miller, with no shame, said that there's a quota of 3,000 immigrants have to be apprehended daily, I said, oh man, it's over. They put quotas on federal agents, it's over. And sadly, we saw what happened last week. And I hate to say this because I want to be optimistic, but there's so much more to come. Mm-hmm. If this thing doesn't change, there's so much more to come. Quotas it just doesn't belong in law enforcement.
And so I guess to transition, this would be a good just segue based on from the national headlines that has transpired. So I guess I want to use this as kind of we understand that, and I love that part, I'm going to use that, right? Culture eats policy, right? But using this, I guess, more so as an educational moment, because unfortunately now, everything is digitized in a way to where I don't even think, in many ways, the police departments care for, right? With social media, video cameras, so forth and so on. So what happened in Minnesota, if you can kind of from all of your experience, because they had different videos, but there were like 3 main videos that offset the CNN, Fox, and MSNBC showed. How should the regular person, without your experience, one, from a critical lens, view that scenario, which is unfortunately other scenarios that will happen, to have a critical mind of what is happening, but then also how to view those experiences from their side, and then quote unquote from a law enforcement side.
I mean, I'll actually start with another reference to the memoir. Very early, I think chapter 3 probably, I start walking the readers through what it was like to go to the police academy and some of the things that shocked me. And one of the things I learned early in my training is much of what I think I know about policing comes from TV,
Right.
you know, a writer's imagination. Because when we got to the use of force policy, and we were told we cannot shoot at a car, I even objected to that. I'd seen it a million times on TV. If somebody comes, you shoot, and the car stops right before you know, and you save the day. I mean, just set it off.
Set it off.
Right? And you know, we objected to that, and our official company instructor, our instructor said that bullet, even if it takes the person out, that car's still moving. So what are we supposed to do? Oh, get out of the way. You know, be tactical, right? And use of force was the only exam in the police academy that you had to get 100 on. You could not get not even one wrong. If you did, you were retrained, and after a while, you were kicked out. That had to be solid, that you understood when you could and could not use deadly physical force. So watching that video, even before that video, I realized many of the federal agents don't have the temperament to deal with the public, right? And I'll be honest, when cell phone cameras first became popular, I was a rookie, and a lot of my colleagues, they didn't realize this was a First Amendment protected behavior. Many stop recording, move the phone, like we have to be trained and reminded. So I realized those guys are just stuck. They're in the past in terms of their tactics, but their policy, I checked it, DHS and DOJ, their policy mirrors what I learned. It's just there's no de-escalation, the training start, it's get the fuck out of the car. Like it's just immediate level 10. And I know why that happens. The folks they're focusing on have become the other, right? They dehumanize them. The quotas, that's the focus. And I can only imagine what the incentive back in the command is, you know, when they're meeting the quotas, the internal conversations, et cetera. So again, seeing that footage, first, from my civilian mindset, I prior to my training, that's a scenario, an actual scenario where someone is in danger with the car being the deadly force. Intuitively, you would think that's a situation where you can shoot, but in reality, in terms of best practices, and most police training and policy, unfortunately, comes from something that goes wrong.
Yeah.
So whoever unfortunately experienced that decades ago is the reason why we have the policy today, and that was ignored. The policy was ignored that day. I saw someone who was frustrated, agitated, and made a terrible decision in using this firearm in that scenario. This thing has the country divided. I'll tell you this, when it's just cops in the room, we all say, like, yeah, that was a good shot. But I've seen people do that, but then publicly on the social medias, well, she contributed to her own actions. You know, it's back to the tribalism. But again, I think there's a lot more to come, unfortunately.
And so do you believe that even within all of your advocacy, the work that you devoted your life to now, especially post the book, and still being, to your point, in your community, still navigating, still being an ally that folks can call based on various things, do you feel as though with the rise of technology and some of those things outside of the tribalism, that more and more cops or law enforcement, to your point, if they were in a group, like, this person could have got out of the way, or that was a bad shot? Or do you find more and more have been indoctrinated to where one of your earlier points that you articulated about, no, it's just that's part of the job is the quotas, and folks are seeing this, and so that pressure, and so many people who are doing the broken windows policing, they're not even realizing what they're contributing to. Do you feel as though the more video footage and things that have circulated, more police officers, whether or not they're part of it, they're staying true to the tribalism, they're more cognizant that actually that was a bad shot, or actually that was the wrong thing, whether or not they chose to do the adverse action of it?
Yeah. So most cops that I spoke to about that specifically, there were some that tried to justify it, et cetera. A most cops about that specific incident in Minnesota, they agree that it was no good. But in the larger part of your question in terms of what's the mentality overall, unfortunately, people just have bills to pay, man. They're not thinking too deeply. Every time I run into an officer, a rookie cop especially, who joined after George Floyd, I always question them because I couldn't imagine being young during that time and still saying, I'm going to join the police force. So, and many of them, some of them were protesting when they joined, and they said they're here to do things better. Cliche things you hear, but you hope that they can stay grounded because when you actually try to do better, a lot of times the departments, they don't want that, or it's too out of alignment with the daily task. It's the same. The mentality is the same. The culture is strong, man. Culture is very strong, and the irregular hours you work as a police officer. There's so many reasons why you become inculcated into the job becomes your whole social life. There are officers that you're chasing the pension, you're chasing retirement, which is usually much less time than other jobs. And then there are officers that after they retire, they don't know what to do with themselves. There's some sadly commit suicide. There's some who suffer deep depression. There's some who go back to work because they don't know what to do with themselves. You would assume a nice, decent pension, they don't know what to do with it because the job became everything. The divorce rate is high. They're saying that the only people that's going to remember those long nights are your children, because you weren't there, right? So the relationship with the children aren't good. They're adults now, and they don't know what to do with themselves because the job became their entire social circle. A job that powerful, people are not going to go against the grain. Very few people are going to do that. We have time for questions.
Yeah, so that's what we're gonna do.
So we're just gonna listen first, and then
We'll do one and one.
Yeah.
The first question is from Andradia. She says, first, excellent book, and thank you for your bravery. My question is, do you think there will be more whistleblowers soon, given the climate we're facing in America today?
I do. So the thing about whistleblowers is whether or not a whistleblower is successful depends on the people. Because what allowed me to survive the unthinkable is activists and community advocates, elected officials that are usually very critical of police. They stood shoulder to shoulder with me. And the police executives, they didn't have anything in the playbook for that. Because typically it's we're your family. So if you go against the family, you have no one. So the fact that activists were willing to stand, because they realize, these cops are bringing attention to something that's important. We usually don't stand with cops, but if they're willing to do this, let's support them. I need folks to support whistleblowers a lot more because there are two gentlemen that were part of CPP who blew the whistle on racial quotas. I think one was Johnny Gray and Jermaine Broderick. These are two federal agents that I think they left because there were racial quotas stopping folks as they were crossing the Canadian border. But we don't even know their names. There's so many other whistleblowers. So whether or not we get more whistleblowers determines on what happens to whistleblowers, right? If I witness something or I want to change something in the system, but I see others who are trying to say something lose their careers, I'm not going to be incentivized to do that. So whether or not should we get more whistleblowers with everything happening, we will. But I'm asking folks to support them, and including officers, support the whistleblowers, because we all know the truth. I get it. In the family, you talk about things in the family, but at the end of the day, we take an oath to the public,
Hi, thanks for coming. It's been very informative. What do you think is the number one or the first change that you would recommend in public safety personnel training that would make a difference to both the public safety personnel and the community?
That's a great question. There is no silver bullet, but if I had to make an immediate change, recruitment is very important, right? And I don't think recruitment is important, but one of the main things I focus on in the memoir is the whole bad apple thing. We gotta get rid of that thing, because their behavior, it usually comes from incentives, those who set the incentives from above. So the first thing that I would do is find the right leadership. If we have the right people in the right executive positions, then the demands from below change. Because I think of Eric Garner, right, back in 2014. That officer's been fired. Folks know that officer's name. But I promise you that officer had a lieutenant, captain, inspector, chief that they were trying to impress, which is why something like selling loose cigarettes became the crime of the century. So we can focus on that officer, but what if we had a different chief? What if we had different police leadership that would never incentivize an officer to behave that way, right? Police officers are not nearly as autonomous as people think. They just punch on the chessboard, following orders. That was one of the things that was the most frustrating. I thought I would have a lot more autonomy as a police officer. I didn't realize it was just rinse and repeat every day, just hunting people. Thank you for the question.
Rodrigo on Zoom asks, what advice might you give to someone considering whether to and how to co-organize community police relations activities such as cops and bobbers, fishing together in urban or ex-urban affordable outskirts municipalities?
So, and I thought about writing this in the memoir. I chose not to. We don't want to fall into what's called propaganda, right? Because it exacerbates the notion that if officers such and such wanted to be a better cop, he could, right? Because Officer Mallery goes fishing with the community. So what's wrong with Officer Raymond? The reality is both Officer Mallery and Officer Raymond are under immense pressure to treat people like that. You understand? So I'm not a big proponent of those things because again, it furthers the notion that cops are autonomous and that cop that's misbehaving simply wants to be that person. Are there folks that way? Of course. But what we're seeing when you understand issues from a systemic lens, that behavior, I'm telling you, you can trace it back to what's being incentivized from above. So when it comes to community relations and cops, the onus is on the police officers to remember that they are part of the community and what that means. And that Constitution that we swear an oath to, it's about the people. When you think about the Bill of Rights, the first 10 in the Constitution, it's all social justice, right? When you think about it, it's all social justice related. So the biggest proponents of social justice theoretically should be the police. So I forget, I think his name was Tommy Norman. He would sit with the kids and eat chips with them. And people said, you and Tommy are my two favorite cops. With all due respect to Officer Norman, that same kid 3 blocks away will still be stopped at first and still be over policed, right? That is not the way to do it. The real relationships with cops between community and cops have to come. The onus is on the police department.
Hi, so I've yet to read your book. I wanted to know your opinion on the responsibility of the community rather than the police officers in policing themselves. I think, like, for example, today I had pretty much an incident with these drug dealers on my street. I was watching them be raided, and then like there's this one lady that walks down the street, she's like, "You called on them." She's yelling and screaming that. She's like, "I know you called, that's why you're looking." And so then they're all looking at me, and I'm like, "But I didn't call on you. But I wish I could, because I see you every day doing what you're doing and destroying our communities." So you spoke about retaliation internally. How do you feel about the community's responsibility in pretty much seeking justice amongst themselves?
Just to be clear, so something that it's called Cure Violence in Chicago, essentially like community-based policing, where community members take initiative. Is that what you're speaking? So listen, I support it, but there are certain situations where you need folks with proper training. I've responded to things that I would never want someone from the community without certain equipment and training to respond to. So, but the good thing is, overwhelmingly, the majority of incidents that police officers respond to is domestic violence and mental health calls. If we can find a way to triage those things where especially the lower level ones, can be community-based response. There are certain parts of the country where we're already doing that, we should definitely expand on that. But yeah, there's a threshold where, once it crosses that line, you want more, traditional law enforcement. But again, traditional law enforcement that understands their job and, keeping everyone safe, et cetera. I'll tell you, we'll get more questions.
Jasmine from Zoom asks, Edwin, thank you for your service, for the courage to stand against injustice, and for your continued commitment to this work. Based on your tenure with the NYPD, how would you assess the department's direction today versus when you first began? Has it progressed, stagnated, or declined?
That's a good question. So in 2013, in the New York City Police Department specifically, that's when the federal ruling on stop inference, and it was ruled unconstitutional in the way that NYPD engaged. That became case law for the rest of the nation, very important. We went from nearly 700,000 stops in 2011 to less than 50,000 in 2014 because of that ruling. 2014, we started to decriminalize marijuana. 2016, the 5 summonses that NYPD writes the most, they go from criminal summonses that can become a warrant to civil summonses. So now if you miss court for whatever reason, you're not walking around with a warrant. 2018, my fight. And we did this cocktail of progress called Raise the Age of Criminal Responsibility in New York State. Believe it or not, was 16 years old. It didn't matter what you did, you were tried as an adult at 16. The only other state that had something similar was North Carolina. That means the most conservative red states, it was 18. And so supposedly liberal New York, it was 16. We raised the age of criminal responsibility. So all those things led to a different department, different policing. And then ironically, with the outgoing mayor, things unfortunately started going back in the wrong direction. Where the department is now, it needs work, right? We're heading in the right direction for a long time. Things started going in the wrong direction. I don't really get excited about elected officials. The current mayor is something. Based on just watching him and campaigning, I think we have the right leadership there, but we'll see. We'll all see what's coming.
Andradia from Zoom asked, do you ever think we can truly ever have successful community policing if cops are not required to live in the neighborhoods they work in?
I think we can. Again, most police officers' behavior stems from what's incentivized from above, right? If officers were truly autonomous, and this is why we're seeing what we're seeing, I can understand that question. But it's not autonomous officers that are behaving this way most of the time. Do you have folks like that? Of course. Overwhelmingly, it's the pressure behind the scenes that leads to these things that we see. And then the system comes in and defends them. But again, behind the scenes, they even scrutinize themselves. But to the public, they're always getting like you can't talk about my mom, I can talk about my mom. You understand? So again, we can get there with the right leadership.
Yeah, thank you.
There might be one more question.
Thank you again for being here. My question is, as someone who does a lot of work in the community, one of the things that I even have said is defund the police with the caveat of increased funding to mental health, increased funding for education, increased funding for public libraries, increase the social, what's the word I'm looking for?
Services.
Safety nets, My question to you is, being on both sides, does that make sense? Do you understand why that's said? And can you see how if you increase funding in those areas, how it could help with the community kind of policing itself?
Oh, no, absolutely. But, I look at budgets. You have to understand the police budget, like in New York, it's a lot, right? It's a lot of cops, largest in the country. But the funding that we would need for those social issues, the police budget is not enough. So it's not like, if you actually think about if you do the calculation of what would be needed for each respective area and category that you just mentioned, I'll use New York numbers just for the purpose of this conversation. The budget is about $6 billion annually. It's a city with 8.4 million residents. And when you think about the tens and hundreds of thousands of mental health calls, et cetera, the police budget is just not enough. So I agree. So police work out of title probably more than any other profession. I've been called to things that I'm like, I have no training for this. Why am I here? I believe those situations, we can minimize what police officers respond to. And if that requires funding, taking some funds from that for the police budget and funding an existing agency, or even taking some funds and creating another agency, I can support that. But overall, defund as a completely wipe out, and think that in New York, the $6 billion is gonna be able to take care of everything you just said. It's not, and I can tell you, other police budgets in other smaller towns, it's not enough to deal with what's going on in those categories.
Thank you so much for answering all those questions. And just having a great conversation.
One more question? Yeah,
So
we've got 2
to
minutes.
wrap it up, we appreciate it so much, Brother Edwin, for being here. If you, for parents, for folks that might be in education, other segments, other in the community, if you had to say, while the fight is happening here, if you had to give your best advice, and I know you and I will talk a little bit about, you have this next generation that's coming up, getting misinformation, social media, AI is being so real in so many ways. If you just gave if you were talking to your niece, your nephew, whoever you was to give your best advice to how to help educate young folks specifically on what they could do while all of this other stuff is happening, when they engage in law enforcement, what would be that recommendation that people could pass on?
What young folks can do.
And how can they share the information on, if you are in New York, if you're traveling on, a basketball camp or a basketball tournament, if you go and run the park at 11 o'clock at night, and you engage law enforcement based off of the quota, the pressure, how should you respond in that moment? What would be your best advice?
So one thing, you want to survive, right? Because unfortunately things can go south quickly. I always tell folks, I do have nephews and nieces, etc. I tell them get as much identifying information as you can, badge number, name. I always tell them try not to even ask. Just take a look and memorize it. Get as much identifying information as possible. If you feel that the officer is acting outside of the scope of the law, again, you do want to get through the situation, get the information, comply, get the information, and we'll deal with it afterwards. That's because it's important that folks survive the situation. But overall, the conversation when it comes to complying, we wouldn't be able to move society's needle if we simply comply with everything, right? So, but how we do that, how we resist is important. It's always better to resist as a group. It's always better to again, because my focus is so much on the leadership. That officer that you're rubbing elbows with, that's not where the focus should be. All right, and I'm glad that I joined the police department that I can say that so firm and confidently. Another lesson that I learned, I know this was the question I think is important, is I was shocked at the amount of white officers who understood. I didn't expect that, right? Especially after my experiences. The suburbs of New York, Long Island, some of my white colleagues, they said we would never arrest people for things like this out in Long Island. If that was the case, I would have been arrested since I was 15. I did all this stuff. I can't believe, when I heard white colleagues saying that, I was like, wow, I needed to hear that. Because as a young man being tossed up on the corner by white cops all day, I didn't think they understood.
Thank you for all those questions. Yeah, I bet there's also some other questions that might just come up. So if you have a few minutes.
I'm gonna hang around.
Awesome. Thank you. So just thank you, Edwin Raymond. Thank you, Dr. Mallery. Thank you. Thank you everyone who joined us too. Really appreciate y'all. Just like before we leave tonight, I just want to let everyone know about something about the Stowe Center for Literary Activism. So the Stowe Center, we are actually starting a new program. We started it last month. This is going to be something that will hopefully be in perpetuity as long as the Stowe Center exists. So this is called Salons of Stowe, which takes place at the Stowe Center Visitor Center on the first Wednesday of every month from now on. This is a monthly open community conversation series that invites everyone to engage in open, facilitated dialogue on today's most pressing social justice, like social questions, like social issues, just idea of like how can we try to understand our own time, like the contemporary topic to talk about. So just next month on Wednesday, on February 4th, we are actually going to have the privilege of Gamza Oscar, who's a human rights researcher from UConn, and also Derek Hall, who will be facilitating a conversation called "What are human rights?" and who is allowed to have human rights. So on that point, just thank you again for showing up, and I hope to see you at the events. Yeah. So just thank you, everyone.